Hi, I'm Justin Moorman.
And I'm Katie Thornton, and this is the Re-Education of Schools podcast,
where we have open, honest conversations about how to better understand social-emotional learning, trauma-informed care, the whys behind student behavior, and how to help kids navigate it all as they go through school and life. Welcome back to our next episode, Beyond ABC Data with Brianna Sarr Kerman. She is a school psych that we've known for quite a while, so I'm going to kind of kick it to Katie. Brianna, she always does our introductions. It's always slightly awkward because it's all from her point of view, and we see what she thinks of you, I guess. So you're going to find out right now.
Yeah, well, I'm lucky enough I do have a pretty solid bio on Brianna. We've done some presentations together and have done a lot of work together, so I'm super excited to have you because when we talk about kids with really big behaviors, I think the school psych role is so important in that, so it can really make or break some of the building things. So I am introduced my dear friend Brianna Sarr Kerman, school psychologist with degrees in neuroscience and school psychology, as well as advanced certification in applied educational neuroscience. Brianna and I went through the A&E cohort together, so that was tremendously helpful and beneficial. And restorative practice, crisis prevention, intervention, and advanced collaborative proactive solutions from our guy Ross Green. She did some of that training with us. And then trauma-informed FBAs and BIPs. Additional areas of practice incorporating trauma-informed strategies into the MTSS systems. She really set up and really launched MTSS systems in our district with us. So super knowledgeable at that. Teaching co-regulatory and educational neuroscience concepts to students and staff. Embedding those focused attention practice, which is a key pillar in the A&E program. And regulating tools into classroom instruction routines. Effective use of ELL critical data process, which is Steve Gill's work, which is really looking at kids, are they English language learners or do they have a disability? And Brianna has some advanced training there. Topics pertaining to diversity, equity, and inclusion, such as culture responsive teaching and social justice. She has done a great job bringing supervision and graduate practicum students into the schools and teaching and walking alongside them, which have been a tremendous resource. And then believes kids do well if they can, and she is solving problems with kids. So we look forward to hearing you and how you're going to help change. We talk a lot about behavior, but when we get to the tier 3 level, how vital a school psychologist role is and how we have to shift the lens of the role and what we're looking at with kids. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you guys for having me.
Gosh, that's a mouthful. I'm going to start timing your intros with people and see.
I really love her. Did you hear that? She got a really good, lengthy, meaty. There's a lot thing. Yeah, I love her.
Versus uses the shortest.
Yeah.
Is there a correlation?
Is it yours? Is yours the shortest?
Yeah.
Is that what it is? Yeah.
Mine's the at this point, mine's the shortest. She's like, Justin.
Yeah.
So. Brianna, that was a great intro. Not that Katie didn't do a good job, but can you give us a super short, 2-3 minute, what's kind of your background overall?
Sure.
How long have you been doing what you're doing? Things like that.
So my undergraduate degrees are from University of Michigan, so biopsychology and neuroscience. I did research for a couple years before I went back to grad school to figure out where I wanted to work, and it turned out that I wanted to work in schools with kids, and I decided to go back into school psychology. My dad's a school psychologist, so when I told him that, he was a little bit flummoxed because that was not what he would have anticipated for me, and I had spent years saying I wasn't going to go into education, and yet here I am. So I went to Miami University for grad school, and then I started practicing 16 years ago. So this is my 17th year, I think. Okay. And so along the way, I got involved in a variety of initiatives, as Katie mentioned, starting with MTSS and database decision-making and accountability. And as I implemented some of those practices within my own buildings, we started working together at a district level as a collaborative team to build an MTSS team at the district level so that we could help make those initiatives district-wide. I also started noticing that a lot of the ways that I was trained in traditional behavior methods, like behavior modification, the use of antecedent behavior consequence data and analyzing behavior patterns was missing the mark a little bit. So what happened was when we had students with significant behaviors, we got really, really good at modifying their behaviors in very controlled settings with very controlled variables. But those students were really struggling to generalize those behaviors beyond that setting. And that is part of what led our journey back to applied educational neuroscience, trauma-informed and restorative practices, and, of course, the trauma-informed FBA and behavior intervention plan process.
Yeah, cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Katie missed a bunch of that. No, I was just kidding. She did a great job. So let's kind of jump in. So school psychs are maybe one of the more underutilized resources for schools, and I think maybe just not completely understood, like what the role always is by by people in general, and even by a lot of educators. So can you just tell us a little bit about the role and the responsibilities that a school psychologist has and are trained to do?
Sure. So I think school psychologists in general are seen as people who do refer, test, and place kids in special education. But there's actually 10 primary domains of practice, the first of which is database decision-making and accountability. A huge portion of our time is spent in consultation and collaboration with teams, so school staff, families, community resources. We also are well-trained in instructional interventions, instructional supports for academics, as well as behavior, social, emotional, and mental health needs. We're trained in counseling, particularly most of us are trained in brief solution-focused therapy. We also are trained in systems change, like school-based practices for promoting learning across the different domains, preventive and responsive services, crisis response teams, family and collaborative services with outside agencies, diversity and equity in development and learning, research and program evaluation, and that's a big one when you're evaluating the effectiveness of your tier 1, 2, and 3 practices, and then of course the legal, ethical, and professional practice. So those are like the main 10 domains from our national organization. And so all of the things that we do fall under some of those domains, but the way an individual school psych's job looks often varies according to the expectations of the district that they work for, their own professional goals, how they choose to engage in practice, and what time allows for.
Yeah. I am a huge advocate for the school psych role because I've had the pleasure of working with lots of school psychs through the coordinator role, but Brianna is really exceptional at what she does, and I feel like if we could start shifting, we talked about behavioral, mental health, supporting kids holistically, buildings, the idea of having a school psych in every school building to be a resource and really being part of that school culture and climate would be a game changer for a lot of buildings in terms of behavior, supporting staffs, taking some load off the principals, the systems part. You have a really good solid school psych. What a difference that can make in a school culture and climate when you have that access to somebody of that caliber in your building, supporting kids' mental health and behavioral needs. So.
Absolutely. And our national organization recommends one school psych for between 500 or 600 students, and there's a huge school psych shortage nationally. So what a gift it would be if you could have one school psych in every school building. The amount of things that I think we could accomplish together as teams would be immense.
So that's, I guess, my word to out to school districts. Think about your school psychs and differently and look at the capacity in which they have to serve our school communities.
Yeah, there's so much more. I think, again, like you said, Brianna, there's so much more that really goes into it, or that you guys are trained in, experts in, able to help with than what I think most people just surface level see on a day-to-day basis. And so hopefully just even that part helps people understand a little bit more about what a school psych can do and just the value of it. Okay, so FBAs, so functional behavior assessments, if you're not completely aware of what that means, what does a traditional FBA look like? You kind of mentioned this before. And then how do common behavior supports schools seek out to align with this thinking? Sorry, that was a long question. So what does a traditional FBA look like? Let's go with that first.
So traditional FBAs focus upon immediate antecedents, what happens right before a behavior occurs, and the consequences of what happens right after a behavior occurs. They're looking at it from a perspective that behavior is a result of a child trying to get or avoid something. Because it's heavily tied to motivation, it is basically saying that if you reinforce the behaviors you want to see enough, you'll be able to change that child's behavior. And as I mentioned earlier, you can do so quite effectively in very controlled settings. So one of the things that is problematic about a traditional FBA is that behavior does not occur in a vacuum. It's never that simple because we're human beings, right? So children are engaged in the environment that's around them. They're engaged in their experiences, but more importantly, their brain is responding according to what their brain knows how to do. So all of their experiences holistically as a whole person are what lead to specific behaviors that we see in the classroom. So if a child has a particular behavioral response, it is not as simple as saying, oh, this child wants something, so they're going to act this way. Not to say kids don't want things and act certain ways to get things, right? That happens too, because again, human. But more importantly, what happens when a child becomes dysregulated is that their brain shifts in terms of how it's interpreting the information in their environment, and it causes a reaction, a physiological reaction that they are not in control of. So when we say that it's a motivation problem, in a traditional FBA is looking at behavior as we got to motivate them, figure out what they want or what they're trying to avoid, and then motivate them to do something different. The problem is that's what we call a top-down approach. And so I know you guys have talked a lot about the brain and about how the brain works. You're appealing to the frontal cortex. You're appealing to the part of the brain when you do a top-down approach that is responsible for executive functioning, impulse control, emotional regulation. The problem is when you have a dysregulated student, that part of the brain is not online. The other parts of the brain, the amygdala, the limbic system, sometimes the brainstem, have taken over. And so that child is not physiologically able to access the part of their brain they need to be able to respond in a different manner in that moment. So the thing with traditional FBAs is the ABC data, I still use ABC data. I find it helpful in analyzing behavior trends.
Not to interrupt you, what is ABC data real quick?
Antecedent behavior consequence. So what happens right before and right after an immediate behavior, and then whether or not the behavior is sustained, whether it intensifies or whether it stops.
Perfect, okay. So you still do use that?
I do. I utilize that because I think it can be very helpful. Sometimes there are patterns and trends that we'll find that we weren't expecting.
Sure.
Oftentimes, it kind of reinforces what we already thought or the patterns we've already noticed. But again, it's not harmful to use it. It's problematic to use it in isolation. When you don't incorporate the trauma-informed piece, that's where you run into trouble. So the trauma-informed FBAs focus more upon that neurological basis for behavior. They look at it from the sense of universal needs. So I know you guys have talked a lot about universal needs as well. So we're looking at where's the child's sense of safety and belonging? Where is their sense of mastery? Where is their sense of independence and generosity, both at home and at school? When we find that there are areas we can improve in those domains, when we increase those basic physiological sense of safety, that's what allows their brain to be regulated and allows them to access the cortex, the part of the brain that will actually help them be able to respond to behavioral systems, to cognitive behavioral therapy, to all of those other things. It also, when you're looking at a traditional FBA, because you're looking at behavior in such an isolated fashion, you're not addressing the underlying problems which are preventing the child from meeting that behavior. So whatever things have occurred in that child's life that is causing their brain to respond the way that it does to a particular stimulus in their environment, whatever underlying problems there are, they're not getting solved when you're just using a sticker chart. You can't sticker chart your way out of trauma, right? Yeah. You can't reinforce a particular behavior and expect a child to generalize that behavior across all settings in the absence of a reinforcer. And the controlled variables and the right people that they're familiar with, of course. So when you look at the underlying problems, if you actually teach the regulation piece, if you actually improve what we call the lagging skills, that the child has that just are not yet developed to allow them to meet our expectations, then those are the factors that are going to allow us to actually teach the child those skills, improve the child's brain state functioning, and create some stability so that they can meet the expectation. And if you do that correctly, then you're going to be able to do it in such a manner that's not going to require the presence of extrinsic reinforcers.
Gotcha. I think that's good information to have, because I think, again, like we hear so much about whether it's in the terms of ABC data or not, we hear that idea of like, let's change behavior based off of just how we're going to motivate, right? What are you doing? And that's where in various episodes we've talked about, the ideas of different kind of charts or systems that you can put in place that are, point sheets, all kinds of things that we can do that try to either reward basically and encourage out of the certain behaviors. But what you're ultimately saying is the trauma-informed FBA, correct me if I'm wrong, also goes beyond that, relies a little bit more on the makeup of the student's brain and some of their other deficits, and then also relationally then and where they kind of fit into society as a whole, as a person.
Yes.
What is it that is lagging that we need to pick up to help them kind of meet the needs that they're needing?
Yes. So trauma-informed FBAs really shift the mindset from a focus on a choice to a lagging skill the child has not yet developed yet being the key word. And those underlying lagging skills are the things that we will target with our behavior interventions as a result. So they shift the focus and the mindset. It's a pretty comprehensive lens shift, as you guys know, but it also requires a shift in the intervention strategy. So the interventions that we would put into place, the way that we would respond to those behaviors also fundamentally changes.
Yeah. So as we're seeing what we hear a lot is that we're seeing bigger behavior, right? Or it seems like maybe behavior as a whole is more prevalent. I guess before we even jump to anything else, what's your take on that? Do you feel like that's the case? Do you feel like there's an increase in kind of big behaviors that we're seeing in schools? Do you feel like we're just acknowledging it more? I don't know. Like, what's kind of your thought on that from your perspective?
I think we're seeing a lot more big behaviors, but we're also seeing a lot more dysregulation amongst people in general. Okay. So I don't think it's just specific to children in schools. I think it's also adults. I think it's in society. I think there's a lot of factors that are leading to a lot of dysregulation. And a lot of difficulties in terms of engaging with other people, solving problems, conflict resolution, working with people or talking to other people that you don't agree with. Those kinds of skills are, a lot of people are riding the struggle bus right now, right? Yeah. And that's okay, but I think what's happening is that also spills over into schools. And so just as students are dysregulated, I think we as adults are also dysregulated at a higher rate than what we maybe used to be.
Gotcha.
So yes, I do see a lot more what you would say big behaviors, meaning behaviors which are significantly disruptive or harmful to a child or to other people, to a learning environment. I do see a higher incidence of those, but I also see a higher incidence of just frustration and dysregulation across the board. So
yeah, and I just to tag on to what you're saying is we've also seen a shift from, I remember when I first started, standards weren't even out. It was like, just teach what you want in kindergarten, and it's great, right? And now we've gone to
much higher demands
to these systematic curriculum approaches for teachers, so they don't feel like they have the wiggle room to deal with some of the behavior. We've built since then inclusion-based models for school where all children are coming to schools and attending, and we are serving everybody in our communities. We can talk through a lot of reasons why communities are turning over and changing and why the outlook looks different. So I think some of that with the academic pressures, and then the idea that we are serving all kids in our schools and we don't get to pick and choose and zero tolerance policy them out of here comes from a lack of confidence on what we do. And
I think
why
PD
this is important. Yep.
Because I think when, along with those standards, as those standards have shifted academically and otherwise, I don't think that necessarily every teacher feels equipped to be able to deal with the behaviors that they see in their classroom. And you think of, in terms of their education, they get a class on behavior, but a lot of teachers do not feel like they've had enough background and training in some of these strategies, class-wide or individual strategies, which again, going back to that original question about school psychologists, that's where a school psychologist can be very, very effective and helpful in that process and helping work on those even class-wide skills, because things are, different. If you don't have the skill set or you don't know exactly what to do in response to these different behaviors, that's where you need a team, and you need some additional training, support, and problem solving together collaboratively.
Yeah, and really school psychologists are set up to really help support the idea of universal design for learning. They are really masters. Most of you are educational specialists.
Yep.
Really setting up that tier 1 environment so educational access is available to everybody. Because we know if we get tier 1 really solid, then we don't really need, our system capacity is much smaller for that tier 2 or even like the big tier 3 things.
Absolutely.
We shouldn't run every kid through, when your system isn't set up, then you're running every kid through like a tier 3 crisis, and then it seems really chaotic.
Or over-identifying for special education.
Correct, because we just think, well, now it's not our problem. They're in special ed. It's fine. And we've got to change that mindset in terms, because it doesn't, what is changing now that they're in special education?
Right.
And then sometimes people, nothing, I don't have to deal with them. That's what's changing.
Right, exactly.
Justin has to deal with them now, so it's fine. Yeah.
It's Justin's job. That's why we have him.
It'll be fine, yeah.
Well, you've talked a little bit about like the trauma-informed FBAs already. Feel free to expand on that more if you want to. But like, what is, one of the questions I have is, not just how does this shift our thinking, but like what is hard about shifting from a traditional FBA to a more trauma-informed FBA? Like for maybe a school psych individually, but then also as teams, like as you're leading teams through that, what's maybe difficult about making that shift?
I think there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance that occurs because when you're thinking about behavior in that lens, because you think traditionally how most people were raised and how most of us grew up, it was like, well, if you misbehave, you get a punishment. And so this idea of you do something wrong, you get a punishment, you don't do it again. That's kind of the theory behind a lot of school systems. It's certainly part of what led up to zero tolerance policies and the creation of those. So I think that's how a lot of people view behavior. And I think by and large, when you're looking at a lot of systems and a lot of families don't need to utilize other strategies because they're subconsciously already doing some of those relational practices and co-regulation with their children as they're growing up. So you think about it, a baby cries, you rock them, you comfort them, you feed them. So if you have responsive caregivers, you're already subconsciously doing a lot of these practices without knowing it. Sure. Meaning when those kids get older, because they have that relational safety, they're able to get just a mild correction or a reminder, and then they don't do the behavior again. Problem is when kids come in without those resources, as you guys know, then they don't have that system already set up for them. So they don't know how to engage in that. They don't know how to co-regulate, much less self-regulate. And so they really need explicit instruction and repeated practice and exposure to those types of things. I think what's hard is that if you're coming from your own personal lens of, well, this is what worked with my kids, I just had to tell them not to do it and they didn't do it, they stopped doing it. If you don't have the understanding of why your kids developed that skill and why that was effective for them because of the previous practices and how you raised them, then it's hard to understand why this student would be behaving differently. So I think that's a hard concept. I think the other thing is when we think of punishment, we know punishment doesn't change behavior. Mm-hmm. We know that, right? There's tons of research about it. But I think it's at times when students have been pushing buttons or, that teachers or adults, parents are at their wits' end. I get it. I'm a parent. I understand. A punishment makes you feel better as an adult because you're like, well, I did something. And I finally told them that they shouldn't do this, that, or the other thing. The problem is, again, when you have kids who don't have the neurological skill set yet to be able to meet that expectation, that's a problem. So when I'm talking with teams and such, we talk about it in terms of, let's say you have a trigger, which is an environmental expectation, and you have an adaptive skill, meaning you have that basis, that neurological basis, that is to be able to meet the expectation, then you meet it. You do what you're asked to do. But if you have a trigger or an expectation in an environment and you have a lagging skill, then what happens is you get a maladaptive behavior, which maybe instead of maladaptive behavior, we should just say they haven't yet developed that skill set, right? They don't have the skill set to meet that expectation, and that's where you get behaviors that are not meeting the expectation. And so it's a pretty significant shift. I think part of the other thing that's hard about that is it requires us as adults to understand that not all of this behavior is intentional, though it may well appear to be.
That way
it sure does, right? When kids are good, they know in their environment they're going to do what they're used to. They're going to seek the things that are familiar to them,
and they're trying to regulate themselves, which sometimes they don't do it in the most helpful ways.
Right, and sometimes what feels regulating to them is chaos.
Yeah.
And so if chaos is what's familiar and chaos is what they're used to, then that is what they will seek in order to respond to their environmental demands. Yeah. So I think that's a hard part about it.
Yeah. I think I think that's always a big question that has to be asked. That's hard to ask because I don't know, it can be hard to get people on board, or it can be hard to even take the look at ourselves. Is the plan we're coming up with, is the approach we're taking what's best for the kid, or is it make us, as a team, does it make us feel better like we're doing something? And I think that sometimes, again, is a tough question to ask, and it's a tough question to get other people to ask themselves as well, because it can feel offensive. Like, of course we're trying to do what's best for the kid, but we do have to be able to step back and look. So what are some practical resources then, and some training that you found helpful to support trauma-informed schools? Because there are probably educators, administrators, other school psychologists out there listening, and probably have a lot of questions about, hey, how do you make this shift into more trauma-informed approaches as opposed to the traditional way that we've done them? What are some resources that you found helpful?
well, this podcast, obviously.
But
no, I say that jokingly, but I did share this information at the beginning of the year with some of my new colleagues, and they listened to it and they came back and they said, you know what, that was really helpful. It was really easy to listen to. It was easy to digest and easily understood. And they said they gave them a different perspective. And again, that was one episode. So I think the more that there are resources like this that are short, easy to digest, easily understandable, sessions that people can just listen to for 20, 30 minutes and get a sense of what the perspective is and what they could do. I think that's really effective because who has time to read a 400-page book?
Sure.
I mean,
that can be
us
hard.
nerds may, but right? Like, it's a problem.
Or has the attention span to watch a documentary, right?
Right.
Those kind of things.
Right. I think that the work of Dr. Lori Desitel from Butler University, obviously a little biased there going through the AEN program, but it's really groundbreaking training in applied educational neuroscience, and it's highly applicable to the classroom. And I think, she has a Facebook page. She has Revelations in Education, which is her website. Those are all chock full of resources that you can take and learn from. And one of the things that I was just talking with colleagues this week about was focused attention practices. Where I was like, hey, you know what? We got this class. They're all amped up. Let's talk about focused attention practice. How can we implement some of those things? You got a kiddo who may not buy into that. They like to be in charge. Okay, let's put that kid in charge of teaching focused attention practices.
Sure.
There's just different things that we can do within a classroom setting, quick and simple strategies that will help improve things. But I think a lot of her work is really geared towards specific strategies that you can use in a classroom. And it allows you to pick up those skills without having to go through an entire course necessarily. You can just get parts and pieces and then, confer with colleagues. Dr. Ross Green, obviously, Dr. Bruce Perry, some of your fellow podcast folks like Guy Stevens, James Moffat, some of those folks. I think all of those educators are out there to provide these resources in an easily understood and accessible fashion. I think as a school psych, what I try to do is infuse some of those things into my practice in small doses. So we were just talking last week at one of my buildings about, looking at the recast 2022 from Dr. Lori, talking about like how can we help staff understand this, and it's a quick and easy article to read that will just kind of help shift that mindset and help us focus upon what we can do within the classrooms. So I think a lot of it is just accessing resources that are available, and then obviously for people who really want to do a deep dive, going through programs like the AEN program that we did, some of that advanced collaborative and proactive solutions training, and some of those things.
Yeah. I have a question. So we get asked this a lot. I know how to do the ABC data. I'm a school psych. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm a special education coordinator, and maybe I'm a principal. I know the ABC data. That's pretty easy
standard
to fill out. Yeah. If I'm trying to add some layers into a trauma-informed FBA, what are some resources you would suggest? Like, consider putting this interest survey in, or maybe consider this sensory profile. What are some of those resources that you would say, look at these things to layer in to help develop a more holistic view of kids?
So one thing we use is a universal needs survey, which is a rating scale that parents and teachers complete to look at the child's sense of belonging, independence, generosity, and mastery. Again, it's looking at where we can easily boost some of those skills, and where we have either a sense of solid sense of, like, say, belonging, or an absent sense of belonging. I mean, that kid really just doesn't feel like they belong. They don't have a sense of safety in that particular environment based upon the behaviors that they're showing us. So that's a place that we need to start and focus. Universal needs surveys are part of the work from Dr. Ross Green, and they also are available through a lot of other trauma-informed FBA training. So I think a lot of educational service centers incorporate some version of those. We do, obviously, in our work. And that's one of the core tools that we use. Another tool is the lagging skills checklist. Yeah. There are multiple versions of that. The lagging skills checklist that I utilize most often just is looking at which skills we want to examine across different domains of executive functioning, like language and communication, attention and executive function, emotional regulation. Those surveys are also part of Dr. Ross Green's work, and they are also closely tied to the ALSUP, which is his part of his collaborative problem-solving model. Those are probably the two resources that I utilize most often. We used to utilize the Adverse Childhood Events Checklist.
Yeah.
However, what I found in my practice is that when we utilize that, if it isn't a big enough trauma, then it tends to, when we say trauma informed, I think folks who are earlier in their journey than we are oftentimes will say, we'll tend to think, well, they don't have trauma, so it doesn't matter. Whereas trauma-informed restorative practices are good for everybody, and they improve outcomes for everybody. So those are some of the resources that I utilize as part of that. And what I do when I'm doing an FBA, I use the ABC data, and then I also use those ratings to look at what relational practices do we need to incorporate. So when we're writing a behavior intervention plan, for example, what strategies do we need to get the kid regulated when they come to school? What strategies do we need to help them stay regulated, and then to re-regulate if they become dysregulated? What environmental things do we need to shift and adjust based upon that universal needs survey and those lagging skills, so that we're setting the child up for success? It's a little bit more complex than what we typically would do if you get 5 smiley faces, you get a prize. But if we do those practices effectively and consistently with predictability, then we're meeting those universal needs and improving that part of the outcome, which just makes naturally we get more compliance out of that, even though compliance isn't the goal necessarily.
You're talking about that bottoms-up approach.
Yep.
We're actually working up the brain so we can get up to that prefrontal cortex, that we could put a actual behavior system in place, which kids don't have the capacity when they're operating in survival mode all the time. And that's typically what we see when we see the really big behavior. These are kids really operating at the base of the brain, really having, and we have to teach them those skills to build those new neural pathways so that we can rewire the brain to actually access the part that can help them learn to make those decisions on their own. So we're kind of walking alongside them, so hopefully that they're transferring them into like the natural teaching environment and those kind of things.
Well, and to benefit from like cognitive behavioral therapy. So a lot of times we'll see kids with big behaviors like, well, they need counseling. Yes, they do. But if they're, like you said, if they don't have the neural pathway established, and they are not going to be able to access that part of the brain to be able to take in the information and then benefit from it, and much less apply it. That's a very hard, advanced skill that requires the prefrontal cortex pretty much all the time. So you have to build up those from the base up.
So here's where I think we miss sometimes is we go straight to top-down approach. And we're like, they're not responding to intervention. They need a separate placement. This isn't working, right? We
or
do that
they
a lot.
need,
They just need to be they need to be in a resource room all day. And really what we've done, we've given an intervention that actually they weren't ready for. So it's actually the error on our end, just kind of building your system capacity, that they actually aren't even ready for that really high-level intervention that we're actually trying to make them do.
Right.
And they're not ready to
And I think sometimes when we see kids who are so very dysregulated all the time, sometimes what we do have to do is work really intensely one-on-one or in a very small group with predictability, consistency, and regulation. Because a lot of times what we find is that those students, as you know, they don't understand the regulated adults in their environment. That's not how it goes. Predictability is not familiar to them. So you have to build that relational practice in order to get regulation. And then once you get that, like you said, then you can begin to work on some intervention strategies. That being said, that doesn't necessarily necessitate a separate placement.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things we do when we end the podcast, we always want to kind of hone in on something that you want people to walk away knowing. Brianna, we'll let you go last, so you have some time to think.
Sure.
Katie, you're going to go first, so you have no time to think. What is it that you want people to walk away knowing from this episode?
You're lucky my prefrontal cortex is intact and ready to go.
You're firing on all cylinders. You're good to go.
I would say I think school psychs are amazing. I think they are such a wonderful resource. I encourage you to really talk to your school psych about their training and background, how they can support your building or district in a different capacity. I think they are underutilized and misunderstood about their role. So I would start there. I think if you didn't get this from the podcast, the ABC data really does not help and support kids at all. In a lot of capacity, it's not going to change behavior. You've got to start laying other things in. FBAs, I know here in Ohio, are required by state law after 3 incidents. And we're looking at even through tiered intervention services with kids with big behavior, we can't keep on chronically suspending kids. The FBAs, if your district does not have a form, I encourage you to start working at that at the bottom at some kind of base level, to start developing some type of system so that you can build capacity of those being written in those times that they need to be written. And your school psych is a great person to walk alongside you to do that. when we go to post this episode, I think it might be kind of interesting if people have questions for Brianna, we could put those in a chat somehow or find a forum for people to reach out, because we get a lot of questions through things from BCBAs that come in. So doing a lot of this behavior analysis data collection point or ABC data, it's not making really a lot of fruitful gains in my district, because districts kind of default to that. And I think we keep on saying, well, yeah, that's not, you're looking at a top-down kind of approach. You really need to start systematically shifting and looking at the bottoms up of how kids are operating.
And I think a lot of those basic FBA forms that most IEP writing softwares incorporate and most districts use, because that's what they're familiar with, are traditional ABC data with immediate positive reinforcement behavior modification techniques. So even if you do complete one, you may not be able to really address the issue and see substantive change over time.
Yeah,
so.
as Ross Green says, you can't make them wanna.
Nope.
Can't make them wanna.
Can't make them wanna.
Yeah.
Well, I think for me, one of the things that you brought up that I thought was good is that you didn't necessarily take all of your previous training, all of your previous approaches, all the traditional approaches, and you didn't just completely throw them away and say, well, like none of it has any value at all, but that you were able to say, okay, like maybe this isn't the end all, but how do we have to tweak it? And what do we have to add to? I think we sometimes in education, and probably just in the world, I don't know, I'm going to say in the world in general, we swing too far, right? We're like, this isn't perfect, so let's swing all the way the other way. And then we land ourselves in a spot where we're also still not perfect, right? We've swung too far. And so the idea that you can still take previous training, previous understanding, things that you know, and then either add to, maybe back off some from, and utilize it all together to just build a more overall understanding of how kids are working and what kids need. I think that's super important. Don't swing too far, no matter what you're doing. Don't swing too far the other direction. Add to and understand and take away from, but you don't have to just completely ditch something and pretend like you have to start over. And so I thought that was good that you incorporated that. You talked about how you used your previous training still, and it's not like you just got rid of it all. So I encourage people, don't just swing too far left and right over and over again, back and forth over and over again. Find that kind of sweet spot and keep trying to stay as close to that middle sweet spot as you can, because that's oftentimes the most effective.
Absolutely. Well, in response to what you just said, I think one of the things that we often think about when it comes to the traditional approaches to behavior, when there's a child who's not meeting an expectation, it's not wrong to try a behavior chart with them. That's okay. We can try that, because guess what? If they do have that basis and they just need some more explicit instruction or some additional reinforcement or some additional environmental changes in order to meet that expectation, ACEs, then you're done and you've gotten the improved expectation. They're able to meet the expectation. They may already have the skill even if they're not meeting it right then. The challenge is when they're not responding to that, you'll know pretty quick. And then that's the point at which you really need to shift a lot more than just that. The other thing is you're going to have better behavior change anyways. If you have a regulated adult, dysregulated adults, like you guys preach, dysregulated adults cannot regulate kids. So we have to find ways to support our teams and our staff in their own regulation within the classroom throughout the course of a school day, because otherwise they're not going to be able to do what they, even if they want to and have the knowledge base and skill set, it's still incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
So I think when you think about what is the big takeaway, I think for me, it's that traditional FBAs and behavior modification, it misses the mark in creating long-term behavioral change and supporting overall social emotional health and the whole child and development. And then it misses the mark in generalizing those results to other settings outside that controlled environment. The trauma-informed FBA approach, it supports regulation. It supports building a neurological skill set and establishing new neural pathways to be able to be successful in a variety of environments, because you're helping solve problems with kids. You're not doing something to kids, and you're eliminating the need for ongoing extrinsic reinforcement, which is really the point, right? We want kids to be independent and to be successful. So I think that's the big takeaway for me, is just understanding that there's not the traditional FBAs and ABC data. It misses the mark, and it is simply not enough to be able to create that long-term change and improve outcomes long-term. And if our goal is to make it so that students are able to function and be independent and to truly see long-term change so we can educate them the way that we want to, then you can't use that type of data in isolation.
Yeah.
And you risk really doing harm by doing so.
Yeah. Well, Brianna, thanks so much for coming
Yeah,
on
yeah,
and talking to
thanks
us.
for having me.
Yeah. It's been a lot of fun. Always
Yeah.
great to be able to hang out and talk anyway.
It is.
But yeah, hopefully you're out there listening. Hopefully you have a little bit better understanding of the world of school psychs, like what they can bring to the table, what they can help you with, what their roles are, some of their background, things like that. And hopefully you also get a little bit better understanding as to why maybe some of the traditional previous approaches aren't quite enough. Like there needs to be something else added to it if we're really going to start looking at children as a whole, and approaching them in a way that is really trauma informed. That there needs to be some shifts. And so if you haven't shifted yet, if your district hasn't shifted yet, if you're building whatever, if you're out there personally, you're a school psych and you haven't made this shift yet, take some of the advice of Brianna that she passed on, some of the things that were helpful to her, some of the things that she goes to and to kind of put together and implement some of these trauma-informed FBAs. And if you have questions, like Katie said, reach out.
Yep.
We'll make sure that Brianna can get those questions and can respond and things like that.
Yeah.
As always, we appreciate you guys just being here, joining in the conversation with us, and let's go out there and do the work.
Let's go do it.
Let's do it. Thanks, guys.
Hey, everybody, let's keep the conversation going.
Like and subscribe below and keep the comments rolling.